I'm a professor at Lancaster University. I've written some books about climate change and what we should do about it. And I also run a business called Small World Consulting, which helps all kinds of businesses of every different size really to look at what's their carbon footprint and what could they do about it and how can they best respond to climate change. So that's who I am. So I'm just going to talk about the carbon footprint of Lancaster and Morecambe, not in exact numbers, but in broad terms, mainly about the carbon footprint of the people who live in Lancaster and Morecambe, but we'll also talk a little bit about businesses in the area and their carbon footprint, and also, because it's probably increasingly important, visitors to the area. So this is just a simple estimate of the carbon footprint of the average UK person. And so we're looking at, almost everything we buy or do in our lives today has a carbon footprint associated with it. And this is a best estimate. You can never do exact numbers, but this is a best estimate of the carbon footprint of the average UK person. And we haven't done this exact analysis for people of Lancaster and Morecambe, but I have done this for other regions, other areas of the UK. And what you find is, pretty well most areas, it's almost bob on exactly what the UK average is. So this will do as a start point. And it forms neatly into 4 areas, really. So there's about a quarter of it is the food that we buy and eat. About a quarter of it is everything to do with our homes and where we live, but also if you include when we stay away from home, maybe in a hotel or anywhere else. And then just slightly over a quarter is travel, and then just slightly under a quarter is everything else, by which I'm including all the stuff that we buy, but also things like going to school, because our schools have carbon footprint, hospitals, social services, even a little bit for the fact that we're in a country where that's got local government and national government, and a little bit of their carbon footprint really belongs to us as individuals as well. And when we look at what's in this carbon footprint, we're talking about going right down, looking right back at everything it takes for something to be produced or for an activity to take place. So, for example, if we look at the carbon footprint of food, we look at the emissions that take place on the farm, plus the emissions that take place transporting the food, processing it, packaging it, getting it to the shop. And if you look at the carbon footprint of if you buy an iPhone or something, or you buy a any piece of electronic kit, we're talking about the full manufacturing process and following back all the processes that needed to take place, right back to getting metals out of the ground, and all the emissions that take place associated with that. Okay, so to have a look at this in a little bit more detail, just to look at, I hope you can write, some of the writing's a bit small, but I'll just to remind me as much as anything else, I'll talk you through it. So just have a look at the food bit to start with, this bit here, this quarter here. So this chunk here is the food that we buy from shops, and this little bit here is the bit that is for when we're eating out. And where this footprint comes from, it's mainly the emissions that take place on the farm, and it really varies between different foods. So some of the foods that have the highest impact by far are meat and dairy products, especially cows and sheep, because they burp up methane as part of being alive. They ruminate, which means they burp up methane. It's a really powerful greenhouse gas. But all meat and dairy is quite high carbon footprint for the nutrition that it has. Transport is, everybody talks about food miles. Transport usually is not that big a part of the carbon footprint of food. The exception to that is if any food has gone on an aeroplane. So, for example, asparagus from Peru when it's out of season, or food that's been air freighted from Kenya or California suddenly picks up a really high carbon footprint. But if it's something like bananas, apples, oranges, pineapples, melons, anything really strong and robust that you could put on a ship for 3 weeks quite happily, that will have gone on a ship, and actually the transport, it's a bit of a carbon footprint, but actually it's not much. Some of the other surprises around food is that freezing food incurs a bit of a carbon footprint, but not much really. So if you want to have raspberries in January, then by far the lowest carbon way of doing it is probably to have them frozen. Okay, so that's food. I think probably the best thing is to go around each quarter of the pie and to talk about what the options are around here. So the three biggest things for any person who wants to cut the carbon footprint of their food, the three most important things are first to reduce the meat and dairy content. And the science is really clear on this, and there are sort of other co-benefits as well. If you look at managing biodiversity or feeding a global population or something, there's really clear science on this. It doesn't have to be to zero, but we do need to have big reductions in it. And it's the simplest way of reducing this quarter of the pie. The second most important thing is to reduce waste. And we waste something like, in this country, we waste something like a quarter of the food that we buy, or perhaps a bit more than that, on average. And it's kind of goes without saying, there's all kinds of co-benefits in if we can cut that down, it's a way of saving money, and it's just it's better in all kinds of ways. And then probably the third most important thing is around seasonality, and just making sure that we're not eating fruit and veg especially that's either been on an aeroplane, which is a real disaster, or that if it hasn't been on an aeroplane and it's out of season and it's not strong and robust enough to go on a boat, then it's probably been hot-housed either here or in a country close to here like Holland or something, and that's about as bad as putting it on an aeroplane. So three things are, so the one's about seasonality, then waste, and then the most important about meat and dairy, and especially beef and lamb. So that's the food stuff. And there's also good evidence to say, just in terms of co-benefits, that if that change can be made to happen, a lot of us could use that as a way of actually becoming more healthy alongside that dietary change. So that's one area. So then second up, onto the blue area here of home and accommodation. And so this light blue chunk here is accommodation when we're staying away from home. So that's staying in hotels, bed and breakfasts, youth hostels, anything. There you go, a little bit. So there's an issue around, and in Lancaster and Morecambe there are businesses doing that kind of, there are hotels. So there is one question about, what's their carbon footprint? How conscious of climate change are they? Are they doing everything they can to keep their emissions down? Then this chunk here is 6% of the whole total pie is housing. So this is actually the building of houses and home improvements, including the carbon footprint of doing work that cuts the energy use in buildings, makes homes nicer to live in, but also more eco-friendly. But it also includes things like when people rip their kitchens out and put a new one in. All of that is included in here. But the biggest chunk of this is probably the building of new homes. So there are real questions about when you build a new home, that has a big carbon footprint. But if you build it in such a way that it reduces the energy that's required to live in that home, then it's probably worth it. Right? And the balance of it is that a home in its lifetime will usually have a much bigger carbon footprint in use from people living in it, especially over 100 years, massively, a conventional house, compared to the carbon footprint of building it. But still, it's an issue. And then the two big chunks here are, this is household fuel. For most people in Lancaster and Morecambe, this would be the gas bill. And here's the electricity. Smaller, but still really important. So to decarbonise, the challenge is to find a way of getting rid of this gas bill and also decarbonising the electricity. So at the national level, there's all sorts going on that's reducing the carbon footprint of our electricity anyway, but clearly the less we use of it, the better that is. And here the challenge is to use less gas and find ways of making our homes more efficient and, by the way, more comfortable to live in. It's nicer to live in a home that doesn't leak out energy because it's easier to keep it warm and comfortable. And can we find ways of using electricity instead of gas? And there's a whole lot of kind of technical challenge over that I think you'll hear more of later. So onto the second chunk of the pie. How am I doing in time? Yeah.
6 minutes.
6 minutes, wow. Onto the second part. So travel, the big deals in travel are driving. So this is the fuel that we use when we're driving. And this chunk here is the carbon footprint of manufacturing the car itself. So it's something like a quarter of the carbon footprint of driving is the manufacture of the car itself. So, and the ways to reduce this are to drive less, to drive more carefully, in the end, to electrify our cars. But that's not a silver bullet because the electricity has to come from somewhere. and that energy cost still puts a real burden on, that energy has a carbon footprint. And also electric cars have a huge carbon footprint to manufacture. So it's not a silver bullet. We still need to drive less as we electrify, even though we do need to electrify. Co-benefits around this. In the UK, 40,000 people a year die from, it's estimated, as a result of air pollution, and most of that comes from vehicles. So, co-benefits around electrifying, but also if we could get people into other modes of transport, huge co-benefits, potentially cost savings, potentially health benefits, especially if we can get people walking, cycling. Electric bikes, by the way, are a really good way of getting around with much smaller energy, dramatically smaller energy demand from driving an electric car. Flying, as some people don't fly at all, but for some people it's the only thing that matters in their carbon footprint. So there's no getting around the carbon footprint of flying. We don't know how to put an aeroplane in the sky on a long-haul journey without burning through something in the region of 100 tons of fuel. And we just haven't got the technology for it. So we can have some flying in the low-carbon world, but there's no getting around the need to fly less. And these bits here are the other forms of transport, which basically the more we have public transport, the better, because it's so much more efficient than individual cars. And then on to the last chunk here, which is everything else. And I really want to talk about this other non-food shopping. So apart from cars and houses, all the other things that we buy that you can't eat. And that's furniture, clothing, IT kit, anything you can think of. And the question here is, can we find ways of buying less stuff, making our stuff last, getting away from fast fashion and getting into buying things of quality that we really make last? Can we make those things? Can we look after those things? Can we get them repaired when they break instead of throwing them in the bin? And if you think about the local economy, if you look at where the money goes, supposing your washing machine breaks down and you've got a choice, you either chuck it in the skip and get it and buy a new one, or you take it down the road and get it repaired for half the price of a new washing machine, then you've saved half the price of a washing machine. But not only that, but if you look at where the money you've spent goes, then a much higher proportion of that stays in Lancaster and Morecambe. So there are potentially huge employment and economic local benefits around if we can get an economy where stuff is repaired and the high streets are full of places that can repair your clothing, maintain your clothing, rework your clothing into new things, second-hand shops, second-hand markets, all of that stuff potentially really, really good for the local economy. And then, so can we make our products last twice as long? Can we share things? Can we have, if there are going to be cars, can we have more of them shared? What about, are there some clothing that only gets worn once or twice? And that actually you'd be better off hiring it? What about, does everybody need a lawnmower, or can you have those shared? I mean, all sorts of products we can look at. If we can reduce the amount of stuff that we all need to own individually, that's much cheaper. It's much better for the environment, and if we can make it work for us, potentially it's more sociable as well. So there we go. I'm preciously really short of time. Just really quickly. So businesses, the issues for businesses are around. In Lancaster there'll be businesses serving all of these consumption needs that we've got. And so the question is, what are their energy requirements? And even more to the point, more and more businesses are looking at how can we cut the carbon in our own supply chains, which is quite complex, but it's a layer of activity that people are getting involved with more and more. And then the other thing I want to mention for Lancaster and Morecambe is that I know that, and especially if the Eden project comes up here and stuff, the visitor economy is really important. So there's a question of, when you look at cutting your carbon as a district, are you going to include your visitors, everything that they buy and do when they're getting here? And actually, even more to the point, the biggest part of the visitors' carbon footprint is likely to be the carbon footprint of travelling when they get on their way to get here. So we've done a piece of work for Cumbria recently, and they are going to include visitors' travel carbon footprint to get to Cumbria, because it's a really important thing, and it's something that they can do things to minimise, and it might be something that you put on the equation as well. So this is here, health, education, other public services. So this is how we run our schools, how we run our hospitals, all those kinds of things. They too have a carbon footprint. So, and potential co-benefits. So if you can get schools, for example, to be really on the case, that sends out a fantastic message to kids. Hospitals are really interesting because you wouldn't want to do anything that in any way compromised the healthcare. But on the other hand, when people come to hospital, they often have a moment when they're really thinking hard about life and what matters to them and reevaluating a lot of things, and it's potentially it's an opportunity to make all sorts of suggestions about how life could be better and more sustainable and healthier while you're at it. So I hope I've created a picture in which there are opportunities in all these parts of the pie to, if we get it right, to make life better, not worse. There are co-benefits here that potentially it's healthier and can also be cheaper if you want to manage budgets, to have less meat and dairy and waste less food and cut out air freight. Potentially, homes are more comfortable to live in and they're cheaper to live in if people aren't using so much energy in them. And if we're building houses the right way, it's such a shame when a house gets built with bad energy credentials because you're stuck with it for so long. And potentially here there are real health benefits, around getting out of cars. And I'll just mention the flying thing actually. So people coming from the UK to visit Lancaster and Morecambe, that's a really good win if they're doing that instead of flying off to the other side of the world. So you've got potential for sustainable tourism here. Right, thank you. Stop.